All right, it's time now for our ETF Spotlight. We're taking a look at the Spider Healthcare Sector ETF. The ticker there is the XLV. As you see, lower since the beginning of last week. Of course, a different story, though, for one of the core holdings, Merck. That stock is up more than 14% just in the last week, and extending gains this morning as you see another 2.5%. Of course, the data that the drug maker and its partner Ridgeback Biotherapeutics released about the experimental antiviral molnupiravir is the key reason for that move higher. Also did a fairly large deal last week as well. Here to break down the space, Morningstar's Damian Conover. And Damian, let's start with Merck and get your sense here in terms of what molnupiravir can do for the company. Now, what kind of sales numbers are you looking at for next year and beyond?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's definitely been a catalyst in the stock. And, this drug looks very, very good. It looks like it's at least 50% effective in keeping people out of the hospital and preventing death. So really important new drug. And importantly, it is orally administered. That's really important because really the only drug we have right now for this sort of early onset of COVID are these antibodies, which work well, but you have to be infused intravenously. So that's a big headache for patients. So pretty important drug for Merck. We think peak sales potential for this drug are a little bit over $3 billion annually. But here's the important point. When we think about this drug, we think the duration of sales probably aren't going to be as long as some of its cancer drugs that look really well positioned. And that's largely due to the likely scenario that we'll see increased vaccine utilization. And we'll probably see less COVID cases as we get into sort of that 2024 time period and beyond. But nevertheless, in the near term, a nice shot in the arm for Merck.
Yeah, so to speak, of course. But this one you take orally. I do wonder, though, in speaking to the founders of Ridgeback on Friday, there is at least a hope, if not an expectation, that there may be broader usage for this drug. It may not just be COVID-19 that we're talking about, but any number of other coronaviruses or even flus. Is that at all part of your model?
That's really upside. There's upside not only in the current COVID case where this drug could be used more in a preventative setting. We'll get data on that probably early next year. But beyond COVID, there is potential for this drug to be used more broadly. And that could be a much longer duration of sales and a lot more potential, both for Ridgeback and for Merck. But it's very early days for those sort of extension studies. But nevertheless, further upside possible.
Yeah, and finally, for the longer term, you mentioned the usage of molnupiravir may spike but then wane. What about Keytruda, which is a key drug, of course, for this company, coming off patent? Is there a gap there still for Merck that they're trying to perhaps attack through that acquisition they did last week?
Yeah, I think there is a gap that Merck's going to need to fill eventually. But let's keep in mind, Keytruda, really important drug, really well positioned competitively, really not facing generic competition for almost a decade. So there's a lot of time here for Merck to generate enormous amount of cash flows and redeploy those capital allocation, really like what we saw late last week with the acquisition. And I think further acquisitions happen. We think Merck looks undervalued, and we think the concern about the increased amount of cash flows coming from Keytruda are overdone because the drug by itself looks well positioned and the duration of cash flows look long enough to be able to redeploy that capital to do more acquisitions and develop their internal pipeline.